New videos every day. Life, wisdom.
So Terry, you're the founder of Texans United for Reform and Freedom. Tell us, what are some of the main issues or main problems that you think people should be aware of?
We are going away from an affordable, freely accessible, tax-funded road system, pay-as-you-go with gas taxes and other user fees that have traditionally funded our road system, into the world of debt financing and toll roads, particularly privatizing our public infrastructure through something called public-private partnerships. So a lot of people don't realize that we are literally moving away from a gas tax funded road system that has been very affordable and freely accessible to everybody into one that's going to be inhibiting your freedom to travel and essentially pricing you off of your own public road system because of the tax rate being in the hands of not only unelected public toll entities, but if they privatize the road, it's going to be put in the hands of private companies, and they can be foreign companies at that.
Wow. So you're saying that our public infrastructure, the roads that we drive on, which our government is supposed to provide to us,
That's right.
And take care of us and provide that as part of the public infrastructure, the responsibility for building these roads and stuff is actually being given to for-profit corporations.
Absolutely.
How does that even come about?
Well, because our gas taxes and road user fees have been a fixed amount for the last 20 years, both on the state and federal level on the gas tax, and hasn't gone up, and there's no adjustment for inflation or anything to take into account greater fuel efficiency in our cars, we basically have a declining source of revenue. On top of that, our legislators, both on the state and federal level, continue to raid our gas tax money for non-road purposes. When you add all that up, we have a road funding shortfall. To make up that shortfall, they know that increasing taxes outright is very unpopular, particularly with gas prices as high as we've had since 2008 when the first spike happened to $4 a gallon. So they've turned to debt financing and doing it with these private road concessionaires. And what happens is they actually are using the private entity's debt capacity in part. And that's their excuse for handing over the infrastructure to these private companies because supposedly they're transferring the risk from the taxpayer borrowing that money and shifting it to the private sector. So that if the toll road goes belly up, for instance, it's supposed to be the private sector that takes it on the chin, not you and I, the taxpayer. That's the difference between the public debt financing these projects and private debt. However, that's the argument for privatizing our infrastructure, including the fact that they try to say this is a free market solution to funding our roads, that those who use the road should be paying for the road. Well, we already have a user fee, and it's the gas tax. The more you use, the more you pay. So that model has worked since Eisenhower built the interstate highway system back in the 50s. So really, it hasn't been a problem. The issue is our user fees haven't been adjusted. And our lawmakers can't keep their mitts off of our gas tax money either. But privatization now, the way that these public-private partnerships are taking place is it's not a truly private road. A private road would not use any eminent domain. It would pay landowners in the path of wherever they want to put this road, the private investors want to put the road, a price they're willing to sell for, in other words, a market rate, and they would pay themselves back for that, building this alternative road with tolls. That would be a completely private model, and there's no taxpayer money involved, and there's no taxpayer guarantees involved, which I don't think most people would oppose that if there were private companies that wanted to do a truly private road. But what they're doing is a public-private partnership. And the reason why public is in there is because there's all these gotcha provisions that put the taxpayer on the hook for the losses. Or we have this corporate welfare aspect of it where taxpayer money goes into the deal to subsidize it, which essentially is socializing the losses and privatizing the profits in the way that they're structuring these deals.
Wow. So, I mean, it seems like the argument some people might ask is, well, don't we need toll roads? What would be the alternative to this? Can you explain a little bit more about I guess, what the previous tolling situation was and how that situation worked in a way that didn't create this huge amount of debt.
Well, the traditional publicly run turnpikes, I mean, some of them in the Northeast have been around for generations. And those projects, ultimately a well-conceived toll project, a traditional turnpike would be a brand new road that's a true alternative to your existing tax-funded road system, which is funded with gas taxes primarily. And they would get paid back over time because you'd have to borrow the money ahead of time to get the road built, and you pay it back over time with tolls. And a well-conceived toll road would take the toll off the road when it's paid for, and it would just become part of the regular state or federal highway system. And those were funded with primarily what's called toll revenue bonds. The toll revenue bonds were private investors, but it was backed by the toll revenues. So if the traffic didn't show up for that toll road, it was the private investor who took the hit for the loss, not the taxpayer. Right. Well, now we have this hybridized version. Even our publicly run toll roads now are using some public debt, and the taxpayers are on the hook. If that toll road traffic doesn't show up, they might use state gas tax money or some other type of sales tax or other type of a revenue stream to pay back that failed toll road. Whereas in the old days, in a traditional turnpike model, there was no taxpayer money involved by and large. So then when you have it privatized, they're doing the same thing. They found all kinds of ways to write these sweetheart deals so that they never lose money on the deal. They either use taxpayer money to subsidize it on the front end, or they use taxpayer money to bail them out on the back end if the traffic doesn't show up to take the road. So there's a lot of issues involved with this new hybridized toll roads. And in some cases, like the Katy Freeway on I-10 in Houston, that road was expanded. It's now, I think, 16 lanes or some such thing. And there's 4 lanes in the middle that are now tolled. Those lanes were completely paid for with federal and state gas tax dollars. And yet people are having to pay a toll to use those lanes. So back on the traditional turnpike, your toll was actually paying for that road and that road only. So it was truly a user pays. Now we have roads being built with gas tax money and all other types of public pots of money, whether it's federal or state and even local, to pay for the road. Yet you're having to pay again a toll to drive on a road that's already been built and paid for with your gas tax money. So it's a huge double tax scheme. So there's not that transparency anymore. I mean, when you think toll road, it's not like that traditional turnpike model. Most states are now into this hybridized version where they're using tax money mixed with toll revenues to pay these projects off. And sometimes they never take the toll off the road. Like you see, I mean, the New Jersey Turnpike, the New York Turnpike. In fact, there's a huge revolt happening right now in New York where they're jacking up the toll, in some cases doubling the toll. Some of them now are $12 or $14 a day just to cross a bridge.
Wow.
And they're using it to pay for other projects, the mass transit projects and other needs of New York City instead of it going to roads. So now your user's not paying for the road. Now it's just a way to pilfer money out of the taxpayers' pockets for anything the government decides they want some money for. And because tolls generally used to be a user fee, people don't see it as taxation. But really the way that we're doing this is a hidden tax, and it is a double tax. And when you put it into a privatized toll road, these public-private partnerships, well, now it's corporate welfare. And that's even worse because that money never goes back into the public coffers for any public use or any public purpose.
So it sounds like these privately owned corporations, by entering into this public-private partnership, are now actually making a profit off of our tax dollars?
Exactly. It socializes the losses and privatizes the profits. It's not unlike how they structured the mortgage crisis that we had that required the TARP bailout just a number of years ago. So we have a huge, what I would call infrastructure bubble that is being built similar to, in fact, the first public-private partnerships were Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. What does that tell you? We are setting ourselves up for another huge bailout where they monetize these public assets and they spread this viral toxic debt all throughout so many different asset classes that you can't control it. When one goes south, a whole bunch of them are going to be affected because they use the toll revenues from one project to now issue debt for another project, and then use those toll revenues to issue debt for another project. And sometimes they use debt to get more debt. So they're multi-leveraging the debt on top of multi-leveraging the assets.
Right.
So we're creating this huge problem. And then there's also the sweetheart provisions that are included in these contracts to make sure that the public or the private entities never lose money on the deal, including manipulation of our traffic.
Right. So is public safety increased by handing something over to a private organization? Because we would hope that these new public-private partnerships, there would be some advantage. Is there an advantage in public safety, for instance?
Actually, there's a disadvantage because there's no longer an incentive to have the public interest and public safety as one of the top missions. Our highway department has that down as one of their primary missions is to be guardians of the public safety on our highway system. Obviously, we know that there's fatalities from traffic accidents every day that happen in our state, and they take safety very seriously at our public highway department. But when you're a private for-profit company, you don't care so much about public safety as you do about making money off the road. And in fact, sometimes they can use lower quality or different types of roadbed than would be our normal highway standard. In fact, on State Highway 130, which is the first foreknown toll road to open in Texas, opened last fall of 2012, and it's run by this private Spanish company, Cintra. And on that project, they used a different kind of a pavement. And they had tens of millions of dollars in damage done to that road from cracking before the road even opened.
Oh my goodness.
And they blamed it on the drought, but I-35 didn't have cracking. I-10 didn't have cracking. Our other state highways that were built by our TxDOT, our highway department, didn't have that cracking. So here they brag about how they can innovate because, that's what one of the other excuses for privatizing our roads is that it brings innovation that the highway department may not think of themselves. Well, innovation can also mean less public safety. We also had a case here in Austin where there were 5 pillars to an interchange that had to be torn down and rebuilt because they were found to not meet safety standards and would have been, who knows how many fatalities could have been caused by the shoddy work of that contractor. But let's talk a minute about speed limit manipulation, because that's another way that these projects throw public safety under the bus. There's actually provisions in these contracts. For instance, State Highway 130, again, this Cintra run toll road, gave the highway department a financial incentive based on they would get paid more money for how high they would set the speed limit. So if it was 70 miles per hour, they'd get X amount. If it was 80 miles an hour, they'd get X amount. Well, TxDOT went all the way to the max, and they raised the speed limit on that tollway to 85 miles per hour. And for doing so, they got the maximum payoff, or what I would say is a bribe, from this private foreign company to $100 million.
Wow.
That's how much money they got paid to raise the speed limit on that tollway. At the same commission hearing that the Texas Transportation Commission passed the initiative to increase the speed limit on Cintra's tollway, they subsequently decreased the speed limit on the surrounding free road, which was Highway 183 through the Lockhart area. It used to be 65 miles per hour. They lowered it to 55 miles per hour to slow your free route and increase your tollways to high speed to try and incentivize more traffic to take the toll road. I'm sorry, that's just a fraud.
Right.
And it puts public safety under the bus and puts profits ahead of the public interest. So that's just one example of how it's making our roads less safe. Then you also have some design flaws. When you have these managed toll lanes in the middle of a highway, used to be that these turnpikes were a true alternative road system. It was a greenfield project, brand new road. Now they're trying to put toll lanes in the middle of our existing roads. In some cases, they're taking over our entire existing road and tolling it, which is a huge double tax. But most of them are these managed toll lanes. They call them managed lanes. They can't even use the word toll because, of course, people associate that with big money. So they call them managed lanes, I guess, to try and make us feel better about the taxing they're about to do. And I think it's a way to keep the public in the dark. So when you hear managed lane, know that those means toll lanes.
Yeah.
And so you have potentially these high-speed toll lanes that obviously are going to have a lighter traffic load because fewer people can use them in the middle of what remains a congested freeway on either side of these high-speed lanes. So how do you get into and out of these high-speed lanes with all these congested lanes you have to cross. So it just sets up by all the speed differentials, a huge public safety problem. And a lot of times there's just not enough on-ramp and exit ramp and acceleration and what they call deceleration lanes to really get safely onto and off of these toll roads. And of course, toll roads are going to be far more limited access and what they call a controlled access than when it's a free road where you have more frequent exits. So your freedom to travel and public safety are both at risk when we privatize our public road system.
What can people do?
Well, they got to get involved. And one of the things you have to start doing is questioning. When you hear about these toll projects, one thing that's very nice when it comes to this type of policy, which other policies can really sneak in under the radar, with road projects, there's a federal law that all the states have to follow when they do these road projects in order to get environmental clearance from the Federal Highway Administration. They have to do a public hearing process. And when you hear of these public hearings as they come to your city or town, it's imperative that you attend and that you find out some of the details. This is no longer the traditional turnpike. This is a new way of corporate welfare and cronyism like we've never seen before. By the way, these public-private partnerships are not even competitively bid. In Texas, they've replaced the traditional low bid procurement process with one of what's called best value bidding. And best value bids means that they can hand it out to their cronies and anyone they want to, essentially. Mm-hmm. And really, this public-private partnership world is very few companies that have the ability to bring this kind of financing to the table. So it's really a big boys game, and there's very, very few of them. So it's really, really easy to team up and steer these contracts to the well-connected instead of to the best deal for the taxpayer, which traditionally was the low bid method of procurement. So people have got to get involved. They need to understand how these roads are being funded. Ask questions like, are you using any public money on this deal? If you're going to privatize it, what's involved? Are you going to let them manipulate our speed limits? Or does this involve a non-compete provision that allows them to penalize us for expanding free roads around this toll road? Mm-hmm. And there's also, some of that has also driven up our cost of building roads because now you've got profit built in. Whereas before we didn't have to account for that in our cost per mile. So a lot of times we can do it a lot cheaper and quicker when we don't mess around with all of this public-private partnership, complex road contracting. So find out, we found out in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, they did these 2 foreign-owned toll projects and contracts, never once used the word toll in the hearing, called them managed lanes. No one knew what that was. And they never once mentioned that it was going to be handed to a private entity who was now going to control your toll rate. They never even mentioned how much the toll rates would be, which in this case was 75 cents a mile.
Wow.
And they also have all kinds of provisions where the Texas taxpayer has to be on the hook for the uncollectible tolls that this private company can't collect, like from out-of-state drivers. And in the case of Texas, we have an international border. So international drivers, same thing. They get a free ride on all these Texas toll roads because there's no way for them to bill them because they're all electronic. There's no toll booth to collect it. And so we, the taxpayer, are on the hook for those kinds of losses. So there's all kinds of little gotcha provisions in there that make sure that these private entities never lose money on the deal. And the more questions you ask and the more involved you are, the better off everyone's going to be. And we can't hold them accountable unless we're informed. Right. So it really takes, and you don't necessarily have to dig deep into these things. It's just a matter of asking some questions and demanding answers, making sure you get the answers that you know are out there. And really, we have to be engaged with our state legislators, our Congress members, as well as our local city councils. There's a role to play in transportation at the state, federal, and local level. In fact, local level is probably where we have the greatest opportunity to put a stop to some of this, right, because it's much easier to impact a city council race or a county commissioner's race than it is to try and unseat a congressman that has a huge district and takes lots and lots of money to unseat. And there's something called a metropolitan planning organization. I know that sounds very government speak, but they're called MPO for short. And they have to have monthly meetings, and it's open to the public. And essentially, your road doesn't get built. If you're in a metro area of 50,000 population or greater, your road will not get built if it's not in a local MPO plan. So whether or not it's going to be tolled is designated in those plans. And if you just ask some questions at a public meeting or of your local officials, you can find out if what the future toll projects are for your area. And you can ask questions about, well, why can't we do this as a free road? Let's figure out how we can get this thing funded without having to use tolls and all this leveraging and debt and all this nightmare taking away our freedom to travel. Let's find out how we can do this as a tax-funded road that's freely accessible to everybody, regardless of status, income, or race.
Right. Terry, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. I do hope that you found some interesting information here. We will make a future video where we'll go into more detail about what you can do to get involved and make a change. Thank you so much for watching The Truth Talks. Be sure to subscribe. I'm Psyche Truth correspondent Karina Rachel. Thanks for watching.